The FBI Art Crimes Unit said the Antiquities smuggling network had gone completely underground. No traceable artifacts, no identifiable distribution channels. What they didn't know was that the answer was running a coin shop downtown, recognizing stolen cultural property through the eyes of someone who had spent over 2 decades investigating criminals who looted museums and archaeological sites to sell priceless artifacts to unsuspecting collectors. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of protecting cultural heritage from those who would steal humanity's shared history, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Sullivan's rare coins occupied a narrow storefront in the antique district, its windows displaying carefully arranged collections of historical coins, ancient artifacts, and numismatic treasures that drew serious collectors, amateur historians, and tourists fascinated by tangible connections to civilizations long past. The shop operated as both retail space and authentication service, where collectors could buy, sell, and verify the provenance of items that represented thousands of years of human culture and craftsmanship. Robert Sullivan had owned the shop for 4 years, providing expertise in numismatic authentication, historical research, and provenance documentation with the kind of detailed knowledge that made collectors trust his judgment about the authenticity and legal status of items they were considering for their collections. At 67, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be. A retired museum curator who had decided to pursue his passion for historical artifacts through private business rather than institutional administration. But Robert's examination of artifacts went far beyond normal collector authentication. While most coin shop owners focused on market value, condition assessment, and customer satisfaction, Robert automatically scrutinized provenance documentation, export permits, and ownership histories with the trained eye of someone who understood how stolen cultural property moved through legitimate collector markets to obscure its criminal origins. What his customers didn't know was that Robert Sullivan had never been a museum curator. For 21 years, he'd been Special Agent Robert Sullivan, FBI Cultural Property Crimes Division, specializing in art theft investigations, antiquities, smuggling cases, and international networks that looted archaeological sites, robbed museums, and destroyed cultural heritage to feed black market demand from collectors who either didn't know or didn't care that their treasures were stolen from humanity's shared history. His retirement 4 years ago had been earned through over 2 decades of investigating crimes that destroyed irreplaceable cultural artifacts. His ability to recognize stolen antiquities had been permanent. "Beautiful piece," Robert said to Marcus Chen, a regular customer who collected ancient Roman coins. "Where did you acquire this particular aureus?" "Private estate sale in New York," Marcus replied, showing Robert a gold coin that immediately triggered every instinct Robert had developed during his FBI career. The documentation says it's from a collection assembled in the 1940s. What concerned Robert wasn't the coin itself. Roman aureae were legitimate collector items when properly documented. What made his training activate was the suspicious provenance story, the lack of detailed export documentation, and the specific characteristics that matched artifacts he'd seen in smuggling investigations where recently looted items were given false histories to legitimize their sale. Over the next week, Robert found himself conducting the kind of investigation that had characterized his FBI career. Not obvious law enforcement work, just the systematic examination of artifacts and documentation that distinguished legitimate collecting from criminal trafficking in stolen cultural property. The pattern was becoming clear. Certain dealers were offering artifacts with provenance stories that didn't match historical collecting patterns. Items claimed to be from old European collections showed characteristics of recent excavation rather than decades of private ownership. And most concerning, Robert recognized specific artifacts that matched descriptions from Interpol reports about items stolen from museums and archaeological sites. "Robert," said Jennifer Martinez, a collector who specialized in ancient Mediterranean artifacts, "I've been offered some exceptional pieces, but the seller can't provide detailed provenance documentation. He says they're from a private collection that's being liquidated quickly." Robert had heard this exact story hundreds of times during cultural property investigations, recently stolen artifacts being offered to collectors with vague provenance claims and pressure for quick sales that prevented proper authentication and legal verification. "What kind of pieces?" Robert asked, though he already suspected they would match items from recent theft reports. "Ancient Greek pottery, some Roman sculptures, and several Egyptian artifacts. The seller says he needs to move them quickly due to estate settlement requirements." Robert's training immediately activated. Quick liquidation of high-value ancient artifacts without proper documentation was a classic indicator of stolen property being moved through collector networks before law enforcement could track the items. That evening, Robert did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He called a number that connected him to people who still fought the battles he'd once led. FBI Art Crime Team, Agent Maria Santos, speaking. "Maria, this is Robert Sullivan." There was a pause. "Robert? How's the coin business treating you?" "Historically," Robert said, sitting in his shop office with artifact photographs and provenance documents that looked like normal business records but represented potential evidence of international cultural property trafficking. "Maria, I need to report suspected antiquities smuggling involving stolen museum pieces." Agent Santos had worked with Robert for 9 years before his retirement. She knew that when Robert Sullivan called about suspected antiquity smuggling, it meant stolen cultural heritage was being trafficked through networks that destroyed archaeological sites and robbed museums to satisfy collector demand. "What are you seeing?" Robert provided details with the precision that had made him legendary in cultural property investigations. Artifact descriptions, provenance analysis, trafficking indicators, and documentation patterns that suggested organized smuggling of recently stolen cultural property rather than legitimate collector transactions. "Robert," Santos said after he finished, "will coordinate with Interpol and international cultural property units. Can you maintain normal business operations while we develop the investigation?" "Affirmative," Robert said, "but they're accelerating sales activities. Based on the artifact types and market timing, they're planning to move high-value pieces before museum theft reports can be widely circulated." What happened next was 21 years of cultural property investigation expertise compressed into the most important authentication work of Robert's civilian life. He returned to Sullivan's rare coins the following morning, not just as a shop owner appraising collector items, but as an experienced federal agent conducting surveillance in an environment where criminals thought their cultural property trafficking was invisible among legitimate collector transactions. Over the next 2 months, Robert coordinated with Agent Santos's team to document a comprehensive antiquities smuggling network that was trafficking stolen artifacts from museum thefts, archaeological site looting, and cultural heritage destruction across 3 continents while using legitimate collector markets to launder recently stolen items. "We've arrested 11 suspects, including 3 major dealers," Santos told him during a briefing at his shop after the operation concluded. The smuggling network was trafficking over $15 million in stolen cultural property annually, including artifacts looted from Syrian archaeological sites and items stolen from Italian museums. "Cultural heritage recovery rate?" Robert asked. "We've recovered over 200 artifacts that will be repatriated to their countries of origin, including several pieces that had been missing from major museums for over 5 years. Your identification of the trafficking patterns prevented the permanent loss of irreplaceable cultural heritage that belongs to all humanity. The investigation revealed that the Antiquities smuggling network had been operating for over 7 years, systematically looting archaeological sites, while the chaos of regional conflicts prevented proper protection, and stealing from museums that lacked adequate security to protect collections from organized criminal networks. Local news covered the story as a major international art theft bust by federal authorities, with no mention of the coin shop owner who had recognized the trafficking patterns or the FBI cultural property veteran who had provided the expertise that recovered stolen artifacts representing thousands of years of human civilization. A few weeks later, the International Association of Dealers in Ancient Oriental and Primitive Art approached Robert about developing authentication protocols for preventing cultural property trafficking. "Mr. Sullivan," said Association President Patricia Williams, "we understand you have extensive experience in artifact authentication and provenance research." Robert looked around his coin shop, where collectors could pursue their passion for historical artifacts, knowing that items were legitimate rather than stolen, where ancient coins and artifacts connected people to human history rather than funding criminal networks that destroyed archaeological sites. "Some," he said simply, "we'd like to implement enhanced due diligence procedures for antiquities dealers to prevent trafficking in stolen cultural property. Would you be willing to help develop those protocols?" "Of course," Robert replied. "Protecting cultural heritage is everyone's responsibility, especially in the collector community, where market demand can either support legitimate preservation or fund criminal destruction of archaeological sites and museum collections." What the association president didn't know was that she'd just asked one of the world's most experienced cultural property crime investigators to design security systems for protecting collector markets from exactly the kind of antiquities trafficking Robert had spent his career fighting. Robert never told his customers about his FBI background or the international smuggling networks he'd dismantled. He never mentioned the museum thefts he'd investigated or the archaeological sites he'd helped protect from looters who destroyed cultural heritage for profit. He just operated his coin shop every day, provided expert authentication services, and quietly watched for artifacts that indicated criminal networks were trafficking stolen cultural property through legitimate collector markets. But word spread through art crime investigation circles that if anyone noticed suspicious artifacts or questionable provenance documentation, they should probably consult with the owner of Sullivan's rare coins. Not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how cultural property trafficking operations worked. Every day from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., Robert continued his work. He authenticated legitimate collector items, researched historical provenance, and maintained the kind of vigilant observation that had kept him at the forefront of cultural property investigation for over 2 decades. Most days, the biggest challenge was researching complex numismatic histories and helping collectors understand the cultural significance of their artifacts. But some days, when his trained instincts recognized patterns that indicated stolen cultural property, Robert Sullivan was exactly where he needed to be, between humanity's shared heritage and criminals who would destroy archaeological sites and rob museums to satisfy collector demand. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career investigating cultural property crimes. You don't stop protecting human heritage when you retire. You just find a new way to ensure that collecting preserves rather than destroys the artifacts that connect us to our shared history. And sometimes, the most important cultural heritage protection in a community is provided by someone who looks like they're just running a coin shop, but who knows exactly what stolen antiquities look like and refuses to let traffickers use collector markets to legitimize cultural property theft. Robert had spent 21 years investigating networks that destroyed archaeological sites and robbed museums to feed international demand for stolen cultural artifacts. Now he spent his retirement ensuring that one collector community remained a place where people could pursue their passion for historical artifacts without funding criminal networks that destroyed humanity's shared heritage. The mission was the same. The artifacts were the same. The only difference was that now, instead of investigating cultural property crimes after irreplaceable heritage was lost, he was preventing trafficking by recognizing stolen items before they could disappear forever into private collections. And every day, as collectors enjoyed legitimate historical artifacts that connected them to ancient civilizations, Robert Sullivan worked with the eyes and experience of someone who knew the difference between legal collecting and criminal trafficking, ready to protect both the collector community and the cultural heritage that belongs to all humanity. So the next time you visit a coin shop, antique dealer, or art gallery, remember that the person authenticating artifacts might have expertise far beyond appraisal and historical knowledge. The dealer ensuring your collection is legitimate might be the same person who spent their career investigating criminals who destroy archaeological sites and rob museums to satisfy collector demand. Have you ever met someone like Robert? Someone whose retirement business perfectly positioned them to protect cultural heritage using their professional expertise? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop ensuring that our shared human history is preserved rather than plundered. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting cultural heritage from trafficking. Because the world needs more people like Robert Sullivan, professionals who understand that some protection is too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear FBI badges and investigate art crimes. Sometimes they operate coin shops and authenticate artifacts. But they're always protecting cultural heritage from criminal trafficking, always ensuring that collecting preserves rather than destroys the artifacts that connect us to our shared human history. And sometimes, the most important cultural property protection in your community comes from someone who spent their career learning exactly how antiquities trafficking works and refuses to let criminals use collector markets to launder stolen heritage that belongs to all humanity.